Hi, it's Penny here, and today I'm going to be doing my reading wrap-up for the books that I read in December 2022, so the last of my wrap-ups for last year. And as usual, I'm going to do this book battle style, which means I pair up all the books, I battle them against each other until we come up with the best book of the month. I need to get this out of the way so that I can do my 2022 book battle and decide what the best book of the year is, which I think is going to involve a lot of hard decisions, but hopefully December's decision making will be a little bit easier. Although I did read 17 books in December, which I'm really not sure how I did that. But let's just get into talking about the books. There's three main groupings that I'm going to cover. Firstly, we've got a bunch of graphic novels that I read. Maybe that's how I got through so many. Then I also read a bunch of fantasies, including some Greek mythology retellings. And then lastly, a couple of science fiction. So let's start out with all the graphics that I've got. Firstly, I did read these three Maori legend-based comic books that actually I bought to gift to someone. I just haven't actually gifted them yet, so I still have them here. I'm probably going to butcher these names, but let me try. We've got Arahanui, Revenge of the Fae, up against Miariki, The Quest for the Truth. Both of those are by Helen Pierce Otene and Andrew Burden. And we'll put those two up against Narara Huaro by Maxine Hemme and also illustrated by Andrew Burden. So the first two of these kind of go together, although the stories aren't really related. There are some similar mythological type creatures in there. Basically, these are comic books where different Maori tribes go up against the Maori Fae. I forget what they're called, the Puta something. That information is not immediately available to me, and I will put it here. But basically, Maori legends include these Fae type people. In this first one, Revenge of the Fae, this tribe is really suffering and they make a deal with the Fae to get this magical stone, but then they don't follow through on the deal, which of course goes badly. I think my favorite in this was the different Fae type people, creatures. They're all just a little bit different and quite interesting, but I do think I actually like this one better. So this one, we follow primarily this young slave girl. The woman that she is the slave of gets kidnapped, and so she ends up having to work together with this woman's boyfriend who really doesn't like her, and kind of finds value in herself in doing that, as well as having to negotiate these Fae people to try and save this woman. Well, young girl, really. Anyway, I quite like this one. I would say for both of these, they are very simple comics. They're very short, but I enjoyed the Maori mythology and they were still pretty fun. Then this other one, no, I've just butchered it like a million times. Narara Huaro, I think. This one is about, I've kind of forgotten, some taniwha that's like just going around and destroying everything. For some reason. I feel like there must have been a reason, because there's normally a reason why a taniwha attacks you. And I think what I always like about these kind of mythology type stories is the way that it uses mythology to explain like real life, normally like geological features or something like that. This one as well though, it's super short, so not a bad read, but just not much to it. So if I'm battling these three up against each other, I'm going to pick this one, Miariki, just because I think it was the best story with the most kind of substance to it. But if you like Maori mythology and comic books, these are probably worth a read. I basically just bought a bunch of books from Huia Publishers to give people for Christmas because they had a special and I felt like supporting some Maori authors. Oh, then I don't have the next two books for the next battle because I already gave them to my sister. So we have got Tamanui, The Brave Kokako of Taranaki by Rebecca Bear and Lindley Wellington, up against Princess Ever After by Kay O'Neill. So these I bought both for my sister. Tamanui is another one where I just got it from Huia Publishers because it was on special. What I didn't really realize is it's more like an educational book about the kokako and how they've become extinct within Taranaki and the efforts that are being made to keep the species alive in other areas. Not the happiest story, to be honest, because the main character is this kokako who is the last one in Taranaki and is chased out of there and watches his whole family die. Kind of sad. And also very short, very simple. But I did appreciate what I learned from it. The other book in this battle is Princess Ever After by Kay O'Neill. So I've read a lot of books by Kay O'Neill. They wrote the Tea Dragon Society books, also Dewdrop, which I really loved. And what's the third one? I'll put it here because my memory sucks. So I was expecting to love Princess Ever After, and I did. Again, it's another one that's a fairly simple story. It is aimed at a younger audience. It's just a couple of princesses saving each other and doing heroic deeds that perhaps you might not expect from a princess. As always for Kay O'Neill books, the art is really adorable, and it was just a really quick read, but a fun time. I really loved it. If you've liked Kay O'Neill's other books, you'll probably like this one too. So if I'm putting those two books up against each other, I think I'm going to pick Princess Ever After. Just the art was much more beautiful. The story was adorable and like made me feel good feelings, whereas Tamanui was not really that kind of story. And even though both of these were really short, there's a lot more to Princess Ever After. Okay, then the last two graphic novels / comics that I read in December are a little bit darker than those ones that I've talked about so far, although some of those Mary comics were fairly dark. But what we've got is Monstrous Volume 7, Devourer by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda, up against The Liminal Zone by Junji Ito. So, firstly, Monstrous. This is a series that I've really been loving. I will admit, it's sometimes a bit hard to follow the plot, and I feel like I need to go back and reread the whole thing from the start again because it's been a while since I read the previous books, and I don't fully think I'm following the twists and turns very well anymore. But at the same time, it almost doesn't matter if you read this book series and you don't understand what's going on, because it's so much more about the vibes, even though there is a complex plot there. And I think if you can understand the plot, then you get even more from it. I definitely have done rereads in the past and had that happen. This time, didn't do the reread. Really should have done the reread. But still, I really love the art. I love the characters. We're mainly following this young woman who is half arcanic, half human, I think. But she's also possessed by this demon, so she's missing an arm, and sometimes this horrible demon comes out of her and eats people. And she's kind of been stuck in the middle of this war and political intrigue that's going on between a bunch of different factions, including the old gods and the ancients, and there's necromancer cats and other half-human, half-animal creatures. Of course, the most adorable one is Kippa, our lovely little fox girl, who is starting to kind of step up and take a bigger role. And there's a lot of characters really playing a bigger part in the plot now. And this is definitely a series I will be rereading again in the future. Maybe when the next volume comes out, because I don't know how long the series is going to go on, but I feel like it could go on for quite a while, because there's a lot in the world to explore. And then the other one we have is The Liminal Zone by Junji Ito. I actually bought this for someone for a present, but I'm too slow, and then they bought it for themselves. And I'm not sad about that at all, because now I get to keep it for myself. And like under the dust jacket, it is beautiful. It's got all these houses with eyes on it, and just like throughout the book we have lots of Junji Ito's dark and creepy art. The stories are really twisted, as you would expect from Junji Ito. I really enjoyed them. I think there's 4 stories in this. Let me see if I can remember what happened in them. Oh, Weeping Woman Way. Loved it. As a crier myself, I could really relate and see a whole new career for myself. Madonna was very twisty. The Spirit Flow of Akigahara? I don't know how to say that. But that one was weird, as with these guys that like, what are they now? I don't know. I'm not really telling you the plot of any of these. And the last one, Slumber. What happened in Slumber? Oh, that's right. Okay, I feel like I can't tell you the plot of any of these because it's part of just discovering what these stories are about, which makes Junji Ito so great. They're just really dark concepts, and like that initial confusion that you feel when the strangeness starts to happen is what makes these books so good, while also kind of being awful. Anyway, this is a good collection of short horror manga stories. So, if I'm putting these two books up against each other, this is a hard one because I've read a lot of Junji Ito and really loved it. Monstrous is one of my favorite graphic novel series. But in this particular case, I will admit I need the reread for Monstrous, and I'm a little bit unclear on what exactly happened in this story. And I do feel like maybe the art in this particular volume wasn't quite as good as some of the previous ones. And the story wasn't quite as clear, but again, maybe on a reread it would be. Still, I think actually I'm going to pick The Liminal Zone just because all the stories in this were really great. And just before going through the contents page and remembering what all those stories were and all the creepiness to them just reminded me how much I liked this book and I enjoyed the reading experience. So I'm going to pick The Liminal Zone as the winner of this battle. And then before we move on, let's pick our favorite graphic novel, comic, manga book. So we're going to put Meiriki, The Quest for Truth by Helen Pierce Otene and Andrew Burden up against Princess Ever After by Kay O'Neill and The Liminal Zone by Junji Ito. I think primarily this battle is going to be between Princess Ever After and The Liminal Zone, just because Meiriki was a bit simple, and like, while I enjoyed it, I do think there was a lot more depth in the other two. Princess Ever After, though, was really fun and light and like all about good feelings, whereas The Liminal Zone was really dark and twisty and the opposite of those good feelings. Like, it's more about feeling really uncomfortable and sitting with like really uncomfortable truths about life, or like uncomfortable possibilities. But I think actually I really like dark and twisty books, so even though I really enjoyed both of these, I think I'm going to go with The Liminal Zone as the best graphic book that I read in the month of December. Okay, now let's talk about the fantasy books that I read in December. So firstly, I'm going to do a battle of three. We've got The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay up against The Betrayals by Bridget Collins and The Half-Bad Trilogy by Sally Green. Okay, technically that's actually 5 books, but whatever. Firstly, let's talk about The Pallbearers Club. I hated it. I guess I've put it in the fantasy section because I thought it was maybe going to be a fantasy, or I thought it was going to be a thriller. Actually, neither of those. So the setup for this book, or what I thought it was going to be, is that we're reading the memoir of this man. He is telling a story where he hints that this girl that he knew was actually a vampire. But we're also getting her annotations within the book where she's like, not sure that this is really what happened. What are you talking about? And that setup sounds really interesting. It sounds really creative. And honestly, it was the most boring book I've ever read. Maybe ever. Like, maybe ever. It was not the kind of book that I enjoy reading at all. Nothing happened. In fact, so I didn't actually finish this. Let's admit that up front. I got about 60% of the way through, maybe even further. Do you know what? Actually, I think I was within 100 pages of the end. But nothing had happened. It's just this really boring guy telling you about his life. And it's a really boring, typical life, and he's trying to make it like really meaningful. It's kind of like reading a pretentious memoir of a really boring white guy who's never done anything with his life. And then the annotations of the girl are kind of like, oh, you're not that bad. But nothing she says is particularly interesting either. The hints that she's a vampire are so vague that I don't even know whether he was really gonna ever do anything with that. And like, just everything that happened was like a fairly boring time. And are they even really friends? Not really. There were a few slightly interesting bits, but just for the most part, really, really boring. And I really struggle to see what the people who have rated this highly see in this book, because I didn't find it interesting at all. Which is a shame because I was so excited for it, but never mind. Then actually, straight after that, I did pick up The Betrayals by Bridget Collins. This is one that I really didn't have any expectations from. I really only got it because it was available on audiobook at my library, and I do recommend the audiobook. I'm not sure if my experience with this book would have been different if I hadn't read the audiobook, and if I hadn't read it just after having read such an incredibly boring book. And I'm a little bit scared of recommending this book because I feel like it might just have been a moment in time for me. But at the same time, I think it's great. I think I loved it. So The Betrayals is about this politician who's got himself in a lot of trouble. It's kind of a dystopian type world, but the information we get about the dystopianness that's going on is very peripheral to the story. It's more about this failed politician being forced to go back to the school that he studied at, where they learn about the game. But you never really get a clear idea of what the game is. It's kind of like composing music or theatre, but with science and philosophy and religion in it as well. But also, it very clearly says that it's none of those things. And I really loved the abstract concept of the game. And so as well as the politician's story, where he's gone back to this school, we're getting excerpts from his diary when he was younger, and he was competing with this other boy, and they were very passionate about the game. And I felt like, for me, it gave me the vibes that I'm looking for from Dark Academia, where it's that passion for doing something great, but also the stress and the competitiveness of it all, like the fear of failure, and just like how toxic all of that can be and how much weight it can be on a young person trying to figure out who they are and what they're doing with their life. I thought that part of the story was so great. There's also kind of this romance going on between the failed politician and this woman who is the first female games master, so kind of like the principal of the school. And there's all this politics involved in that level, but also it's still really about the passion of the game. And also we know that something happened back when they were younger that's causing a rift between these two who are having the romance in the future, and we're slowly learning about what happened. And I just loved it so much. Every time we would get little hints of what was going on, and I would just think about all the possibilities of what it could mean. It just blew my mind over and over again. And I don't know if other people would have the same experience with the book, but I really loved it. I think it's a little bit like Vita Nostra, but with a bit more romance and a little bit less strangeness. So for people who've read Vita Nostra and thought, wow, that's way out there, I don't get it, maybe The Betrayals is one to try. I loved it. I don't know what else I can say. I'm kind of afraid to recommend it and have anyone else read it in case they don't like it, because I just really loved it. Okay, then the last books for this battle, we have the Half-Bad trilogy. I reread it via audiobook, and I was a little bit afraid to go back to this series because this is a series that I really loved. It's a YA fantasy series about this boy named Nathan who is half Black Witch, half White Witch, and because of that he is treated very badly by the council, which is made up of white witches, and their corruption kind of really forces him down a path which maybe he wouldn't have otherwise chosen. And throughout the books we kind of get more and more of a battle between this corrupt council of white witches and everyone else. I had actually forgotten about a lot of what happens in the last two books, and I do think these two books aren't as strong as the first one, but the way that the first one gets into Nathan's emotional journey and just like everything he's going through is so great. And even in these ones, it's like Nathan does some really awful, terrible things. He's a truly morally grey character where he does some awful, awful things, and he knows that they're awful, but also he has no choice, so he does them anyway because they seem like the right decision in the moment. I will also say I thought the audiobooks were really good. There is a part which I have tabbed in the second book where the books get quite creative with the way that they're expressing what's happening. I think the first time I read these books I was like, oh no, my book is broken. And I really didn't know how the audiobook was going to approach this, but it actually did it really well. And I think the audiobook narrator did a really good job of expressing Nathan's emotions. Sometimes the writing is very train of thought and not necessarily very coherent, because in a stressful situation your mind is not very coherent, but the audiobook narrator got that across perfectly. I really enjoyed my reread. I do think these books are as good as I remembered, even though I was afraid they would not be. Although I will say, I don't know if it's just because I knew it was coming, but the last book was not as upsetting as it was the first time I read these books. And also, like, I think on a reread I was much less clear of why Nathan was doing the things he was doing. There's a big betrayal in part of the trilogy, and I think the first time I was like, yeah, what a bitch. But on a reread I was like, why are we mad at her? Anyway, I should say the reason why I decided to reread this series is because there was recently a Netflix adaptation made of Half-Bad. I think it didn't actually get all the way to the end of this book. And sadly, it's been cancelled because Netflix is going around cancelling everything that's great, like 1899, what the fuck. I'm very mad about it. But if you watched the Half-Bad adaptation, they actually called it The Bastard Son and the Devil Himself for some reason. So if you watched that first season and you liked it and you're sad about the fact that there won't be any more of that TV show, you could read the books. They're really good. And you could listen to the audiobooks. The audiobooks are really good too. I actually think the books are better than the adaptation. So in some ways you could say the cancellation was justified. However, Netflix has cancelled just a few too many things that I really enjoyed lately, so I'm mad at them. Anyway, read the books. They're great. So, if we are putting these 3 books up against each other, very quickly we're cutting out the Pallbearers Club because we didn't like that. But the Betrayals versus the Half-Bad trilogy is a hard one. I think it would be even harder if the second 2 books in the trilogy had been as good as the first book in the trilogy. However, they weren't quite as good. They were still good, but not quite as good. And so for that reason, I'm going to pick The Betrayals as the winner of this battle. I just loved it so much. It was a great time. I went through that audiobook so fast because I just could not stop reading it. I stayed up late listening to the audiobook instead of going to bed like I was meant to because I just needed to know what was going to happen. If you read it and don't like it though, don't tell me. Don't tell me about that. But if you do like it, let me know because I'd love to know. Okay. Then our next fantasy battle is going to be the 3 books I've read related to Greek mythology. I did do a vlog about these 3 books. So we've got The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker up against Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes and Percy Jackson and the Greek Gods by Rick Riordan. Okay, so let's start with The Silence of the Girls. I picked this up because what I was told is that this was a retelling of the Battle of Troy, but from the woman's perspective. So it was giving voice to these women who had such a horrible experience during the Battle of Troy. You know, they were enslaved and raped and just had the worst time. And I was looking forward to getting these women's stories. Unfortunately, that's not really what this book is. Even though it is told from the women's perspectives, mostly, there's a whole bunch in here from like a third person perspective that just tells you about Achilles and Patroclus, because primarily this is the story of Achilles and Patroclus told from Briseis's point of view. All the other women of Troy, barely mentioned. The emotions that these women are feeling, barely mentioned, or at least barely delved into. And there is some argument saying, you know, that if such an awful thing happened to you, you kind of put your emotions away and just focus on survival. So maybe. But then when it came to Achilles having emotions, we went deep into them and we explained them in depth, and that's not what I wanted. Especially because not that long ago, I'd picked up The Song of Achilles. Everyone raves about this. I didn't really like it. I just don't think you can actually tell the story of Achilles in a realistic way, in a way that makes Achilles actually a hero, because he's actually a dick. And as well, this book tries really hard to make Patroclus a hero, and I just didn't buy it either. Like, he did the bare minimum. So when at the end of the book, these women who'd been enslaved and raped by him and Achilles, they were like, oh, what a great guy. He was such a good friend. And I was like, no, he wasn't. He was the bare minimum of a good slave owner. I couldn't buy into this. It didn't sell me on the idea that these women would be conflicted about whether Troy or the Greeks won. I was so disappointed in this book because I thought it was going to be a feminist retelling of the Battle of Troy, and it was not. So maybe that's my fault for having those expectations, but either way, I was disappointed. Then the next book I was also disappointed in is Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes, mainly because I thought again that I was going into a retelling of the Perseus myth, primarily focusing on Medusa and her story. So Medusa is the Gorgon with the snakes for hair that turns people into stone. And when I was a very young girl, I think like 5, my primary school teacher in the last 5 minutes of every day would tell us a little bit of the myth of Perseus. I think other Greek myths as well, but it's Perseus' story that really stuck in my head. And I have to say, I think my primary school teacher did a better job of this retelling. And I think that's because the primary theme that this book is trying to look into is the idea that these Greek heroes were actually the ones doing monstrous things, and the monsters in the Greek myths were not the monsters after all. And so that made all the parts of the story that were Perseus just not a fun time to read, because Perseus was not a great guy to be reading about. There's also a lot inserted about Athena and her drama with Poseidon and Hephaestus, and a bunch of other random perspectives. To me, it actually felt like a lot of writing exercises kind of jammed together, creative writing exercises set around the story of Perseus and Medusa. And Medusa herself actually got very little page time, very little development, and that was my biggest disappointment because everything I was expecting from this book I didn't get. However, the other Greek mythology book that I read was this Percy Jackson and the Greek Gods, which I picked up for free from my library. They have like a bin where they're getting rid of books. Picked it up. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much of this, which maybe helped. So this is told from Percy Jackson's perspective, and he's telling you the story of all the Greek gods. So if you don't know, Percy Jackson's series is all about this boy named Percy Jackson, who's actually the son of one of the Greek gods, because the Greek gods always have a lot of half-human, half-god children. And I really thought this was a great retelling of all those Greek myths. Rick Riordan obviously has a very in-depth knowledge of all the myths, but the way that he integrated them together was so well done. It flowed so nicely. Also, I wasn't sure, since this is kind of middle grade reading level, how he would deal with all the murder and rape and all the horrible things that happen in Greek myth, but it was really well done. He very clearly said these things are wrong, but also said, you know, Greek gods are not the same as humans. Things were different. This was a long time ago, so this is what happened. And it managed to get kind of like a good balance between making it clear that things were wrong, but also keeping it lighthearted and fun for children. And also managed to cover just like so many myths in such a flawless way. And I had so much fun with this. And I would also say one complaint I had for the last two books is that they had a lot of modern language, even though it didn't feel modern for the majority of the books. This is primarily modern language, but that fit really well with the tone of the books and the fact that it's written from Percy Jackson's perspective. I do think this would be a really great introduction to Greek mythology. And I think there's another book or two with like Greek heroes and other Greek myths, which I would be interested in reading at some point. So I think it's pretty obvious that for this battle, we're going to pick Percy Jackson and the Greek gods as the winner of the battle. And then we're going to put it up against The Betrayals to decide the best fantasy of the month. And I do think it's probably obvious, even though I enjoyed the Greek mythology retellings from Percy Jackson. It was mainly just fun, like interesting in an intellectual way, whereas The Betrayals had all my emotions. I was so engaged in that story, and there were a few parts in this one that I have had to force my way through, but The Betrayals I could just not stop reading. So The Betrayals, best fantasy of the month. I loved it. I loved it so much. Okay, then finally we're up to the two science fiction books that I read in December. The Psychology of Time Travel by Karen Mascarenhas, up against The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. Okay, so first let's talk about The Psychology of Time Travel. In the story, in 1967, 4 female scientists invent time travel, but unfortunately, just as they're announcing this to the press, one of them has a mental breakdown, potentially as a result of this time travel experience. So they end up exiled, and we are following the granddaughter of this woman as she discovers about her grandmother's time travel experience. Also, her grandmother is trying to get involved once again in time travel. Actually, there's a lot more going on. I would say one downside to this book is there were so many characters, and there was a part where I was really struggling to keep track of who was who, and some characters really only get a very small part. But at the same time, I would say I think every character does add something to the story. As the title would suggest, it mainly focuses on the psychological impacts of time travel. So while there is a twisty murder mystery in there, that's not really the main focus of the story. So the grandmother gets a note basically saying that this dead body is going to be found in the near future and that maybe she should look into it. And her granddaughter is trying to investigate that. As well, we're also following in a different timeline this woman who has discovered a body and is quite traumatized by it. There's also a romance kind of across timelines, and it's sometimes very hard to keep track of because the story isn't linear, you know, and it talks a lot about how time travelers, the way they experience life is so different. So like when someone they know dies, for them it doesn't have the same impact because they know they can always go and visit that person in another time. So their death doesn't really have any impact on them. And it goes into quite a lot of other ideas about how time travel and traveling through time might affect you psychologically. And I found those ideas really interesting. But I do think the story could have done with being a little bit longer so that we could develop some of the characters a little bit better, because it did feel like sometimes we were just kind of skimming over the surface of these ideas without really getting into much depth. Still, I had a really good time with the story, and I think if you like time travel, it's worth reading this one just to get some different kind of time travel ideas. The only thing I will say, I saw some negative reviews being very nitpicky about the fact that time travel rules in this book were not the same as time travel rules in other time travel books that they've read or other time travel media that they've read. Let's be clear, we don't know the rules of time travel because nobody has done time travel at this point. So as long as the rules are logical, they don't need to follow the rules in other time travel media. Then the other science fiction that I read in the month of December was The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. This is the sequel and the final book in the duology of this series. What is the series called? The Great Cities. So in this world, we basically have cities having the ability to gain their own consciousness, be born in some kind of way, and when this happens, humans become avatars of these cities. So this is the story of New York being born and these 6 people, I think, becoming avatars for the city. So 5 of them are the different boroughs of New York, and then one of them is New York City himself. But there is also this enemy that sometimes appears kind of like as this Cthulhu type tentacles, which is why they're all over the cover, and they don't want cities to be born, so they are trying to stop New York from being born or destroy New York. And the first book had so many amazing concepts. I thought the story had so much potential, and I was so frustrated that it didn't have the ending I was hoping for, but at that point I didn't know that it was a duology, so I had a lot of hopes for the second book. Unfortunately, it didn't really deliver on them, and from the author's note, I think she was quite disappointed with this as well. It sounds like a lot of the plot she had planned actually turned into reality over the last couple of years, and so didn't really make sense as the plot of a novel anymore, because unfortunately, the last couple of years in American politics have been quite bonkers. So I feel like the actual plot of this was not very interesting. As well, it's told from multiple perspectives, and so each character really only gets a couple of chapters within this book, which means we don't really get enough of anyone's story. But also, a lot of their stories were not interesting to me. I will admit, I feel like I was missing a lot of context as a non-American, don't know that much about New York City. So, I don't know. I wanted more of the science fiction and cool concepts. There was a little bit of it, but not enough to keep me happy. So, if I'm putting these 2 books up against each other, I'm actually going to go with The Psychology of Time Travel as the best science fiction book I read in the month. Okay, so now we're going to pick the best book of the month by battling the 3 winners from those 3 sections that we've done. So firstly, we've got The Liminal Zone by Junji Ito, up against The Betrayals by Bridget Collins, and The Psychology of Time Travel by Karen Mascarenhas. As expected, this is a difficult decision. I do think we're going to take off The Psychology of Time Travel first, even though I really love that. I really did enjoy it. It was a very high 4-star, if not a 5-star read. But as I said, I wanted a little bit more depth to it. So I think we're going to take that one off. And then if we're putting The Liminal Zone up against The Betrayals, I did really like The Liminal Zone and all the dark ideas within it, but I'm sure you can tell I just love The Betrayals so much. I want to reread it. I also, actually, one thing I haven't said about The Betrayals is the ending is somewhat open-ended. The romance, very slow burn, never really resolved. So if you want endings with everything tied up, you're not going to get it. But again, it's just the way that this book opens up possibilities, and I think you could read it multiple times because you could just keep thinking about all the different possibilities. I honestly, though, I don't know if anyone else will like this book, but I loved it so much. So, The Betrayals, best book of the month. I am going to do a 2022 book battle where I take the best books of every month and try to come up with the best book of the year. It's going to be a million terribly hard decisions. Not particularly looking forward to it, but I will put the link below if you're watching this after that already exists. Otherwise, keep an eye out for it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.